This happened as I was speaking English with my friend who is an English instructor. And we're like, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Boma. And in today's video, we are talking about, is Canada racist? Oh my goodness. I've been living in Canada for almost 10 years. And surprise, surprise, I'm a Black woman and I want to share my experiences. This is a subject that is quite close and personal to me. It's also a field that I work in. Many immigrants who are moving here are probably not white. You know, some of the biggest immigrant countries to Canada are places that most Canadians will consider to be visible minorities. So let's talk about if racism exists in this country. I'll be sharing with you some facts and statistics and sharing my own personal experiences. Don't forget to like and subscribe because it really helps my channel grow, and I'd love for as many people as possible to see this video. Thanks for doing that, and let's get started. Talking about racism this year was really interesting because the entire world was talking about it primarily because of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, something that was very prevalent here in Canada as well. Many Canadians were talking about anti-Black racism and Black Lives Matter.
As a country, we can't pretend that racism doesn't exist here. Anti-Black racism is real. Unconscious bias is real. And systemic discrimination is real, and they happen here in Canada.
And it's something that I have personal experience with as an immigrant to Canada. I've only lived here for 10 years, and I think something people need to understand is that Canadian culture is very tight-lipped and very polite. So there's certain things that people consider to be kind of taboo. I've talked about this on this channel before, that I've been talking about money, asking a person about their salary, their rent, and things like that is considered a very taboo subject. I've worked in jobs where you cannot talk about politics. It's a rule, don't bring it up. You can't talk about religion. It's a rule, don't bring it up, you know? And so surprise, surprise, for many people, talking about racism is very taboo. So unfortunately, that means that people don't bring up racism when it happens to them. Because of that, many Canadians think that racism does not exist. I hope that makes sense. You know, people are not talking about racism because it's taboo, and then the average Canadian is like, see, racism doesn't exist here. It's an American problem. Trust me, that is false. Racism exists in Canada as well. It's something that even our government officials have acknowledged, that Canada has a racist history and that racism continues to happen today. So I think also because Canada tends to be more polite than the States, it means that our racism here is just more insidious and it's just more hidden. An American will call a person a hate word to their face, but in Canada, no, they probably won't call you the N-word to your face, they just wouldn't give you the job. You know, that's how racism works in this country. So because it's not in your face and overt, people act like it doesn't exist. It exists, but as we know, there are many, many types of racism. So the problem with the fact that racism is so hidden in Canada is that when you actually speak out and you complain about racism, it's very hard for people to take you seriously, because for people it's like, oh, but they didn't call you the N-word. Was that racism? Seriously? In my opinion, a doctor being racist to a person in the hospital, or an employer not giving a person a job just because of the color of their skin, is just as bad as calling a person an N-word. But the difference is that in Canada, in many situations, racism has to be so blatant and in your face for you to get any sort of justice. So what are some examples of systemic racism in Canada that I'm referring to? So let's talk about discrimination against newcomers and immigrants. Many immigrants and newcomers to Canada are visible minorities, and they are often overqualified for the jobs that they do. I mean, think about yourself and think of the requirements to move to Canada. For most pathways to Canadian immigration, you need some sort of degree, and many immigrants are coming here not just with 1 degree, maybe 2 degrees or more degrees. And so when they come to Canada, they are often overqualified for the jobs that they do. It's not uncommon to see an immigrant who's a taxi driver who was an engineer back home. It's not uncommon to see an immigrant working in McDonald's who was a manager back home. It's not rare to see an immigrant who's working as a care aide making almost minimum wage who was successful in their career back home. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being a care aide or working in fast food or being a taxi driver. These jobs are wonderful and they're also very necessary to our economy, but the reality is that immigrants are not being paid what they're worth in Canada, and many times it's because of racism. People think, you know, this foreign sounding university is not as good, or this foreign sounding accent is not as smart. There was a study done and it said that that Canada and the UK tied for third place, and minorities there are 11% more likely to face discrimination in hiring. It found that people of African, Asian, and Middle Eastern descent all experience similar levels of discrimination. For white immigrants, by contrast, discrimination is lower and it's often not statistically significant, the study stated, adding that there is no evidence of reverse discrimination against white natives in hiring. I'm telling you, it's something that you have to come here to experience for yourself. You know, a person who has a Nigerian accent or an Indian accent is considered less smart and less interesting than a person who has a British accent, an Australian accent, a French accent, etc, etc. Racism is real in this country, and the most common way that immigrants will experience this racism is when they apply for jobs. Racism is also very real in our education system. Many black kids in this country get called the N-word. There's many examples of black kids in this country being thought of as not as smart as their peers, and they're put in, they're put in classes where they don't have to work as hard because the teacher thinks that they're not intelligent. I mean, a kid should be able to go to school without being called the N-word, don't you think? But this happens in this country. This happens right here in Victoria. This happens right here in British Columbia, and it happens across Canada. Many black kids in Canada are less likely to graduate. For instance, black kids are more likely to be punished. It's not because black kids are more problematic. It's just that when a teacher is racist and they have preconceived ideas of race, it means that they already see that black child is problematic just by virtue of being black. Racism is real, and it's really unfortunate that kids have to experience this right from a young age in school. Another scenario where racism is too prevalent is in the healthcare system. Women of color, visible minority women, whatever word you want to use to describe, are more likely to die giving birth in Canada. I have a friend who's studying to be a medical doctor who's told me many stories of the stereotypes that he hears doctors use it in hospitals. Recently here in British Columbia, our government just completed an investigation into racism in healthcare in British Columbia, and the chief investigator said so publicly that racism exists systemically in our healthcare system.
What I found, in fact, was at the point of care, there is direct prejudice and racism touching all points of care and impacting Indigenous people in BC. Now, that doesn't mean that every Indigenous person, every First Nations, Métis, or Inuit person in BC who seeks care at the point of care will experience direct personal racism today. It just means that any Indigenous person could face it because it is that pervasive and entrenched in the system.
Through the work I do with my nonprofit, I've heard from many women who, have experienced racism, either from doctors calling them names, doctors making assumptions about their bodies, doctors not giving them accurate information, doctors dismissing their concerns, doctors just being suspicious of them and their newborn babies. There's a lot that happens that boils down to the fact that people think that because of a person's skin, they are, less deserving of care and consideration. Another example of racism in Canada is murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. That's something you can look up on Google, but for decades and generations, Indigenous women kept going missing. There was a serial killer in this country who went on and was murdering, Black and Indigenous women for decades, and the police did not do anything because guess what? The victims were Black and Indigenous. Finally, he was arrested and all that, but why should it have taken so long? And that's something our government, again, has acknowledged, that there is a failure to prioritize the concerns and the safety and experiences, of non-white women in this country. That is an example of racism. And similarly, talking about the Indigenous experience, there was residential schools in this country. We have a really dark and long history of residential schools. If you're not familiar with residential schools, those were essentially schools where Indigenous kids were forcefully put into, and the goal was to strip them of their culture and their language and to teach them Anglophone ways of being. So our government has apologized for residential schools, but the survivors of those schools were left with trauma. Imagine being stuck in a school where you were abused, you were beaten, etc, and the last of those schools only closed in 1994. That's not that long ago. So for people to think that racism ended in 1994 and it doesn't continue till today is a bit naive. Racism still exists in this country. It hasn't stopped with slavery. It hasn't stopped with the closure of residential schools. It may just look different today, but it still exists. We can't talk about racism without giving a shout out to our very own Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. You probably know by now, Justin Trudeau was in the middle of this blackface controversy during the last election cycle. He apologized for it. It happened many decades ago, but you know what? It's still blackface. And if our Prime Minister, who obviously now knows better, was doing things like that, what do you think the average Canadian as well is doing? So that's food for thought. On a personal note, I also have experienced racism. Obviously, I cannot tell you how many jobs I didn't get because I'm black or because I used to have a much thicker accent when I first moved to Canada. Right now, I can't tell you I've been called words on the street in the middle of the night when I was downtown here in Victoria. In addition to being called words, I've also been told to speak English and to go back to my country. You know, we're like, but this happened as I was speaking English with my friend who is an English instructor. I mean, I think my English is pretty great. Yeah, I'm an immigrant. I'm very proud of where I'm from, but my friend is actually African Canadian, so you know, Canada is her country. And the funny part is, like, let's be honest, unless you're a First Nations person, Canada is not really your country either. So it's like, should I have told him go back to Europe because he was not First Nations, he's not from here either. I've also had people grabbing my hair in public and things like that, so it just doesn't end. This video is not meant to scare you or anything like that. It's just to be factual. You know, let's call a spade a spade. Racism exists here. Let's not pretend like it doesn't. Hope this video was helpful to you. If you're thinking of moving to Canada, just so you know, I have a Facebook group. Join Boma Nation. Ask me questions about immigration there. Or don't forget to like and comment below if you have questions as well. Thank you for watching. Good luck in your immigration journey, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.